All right. Okay. We are live. Occupy City Hall. This is the Rockford reading segment. I'm just going to move over to make sure that the audio is off. Oh, back up. Fucking, we got some bees out here today. Okay, let's see. Let's see what the live is like. Let's see if our audio is good. Okay, audio's good. Okay, audio's good. You can't hear the singing that's going on behind us, thankfully. And you can also, the wind's not blowing too heavily. We left off on Chapter 3, Crozer Seminary. Chapter 3, Crozer Cemetery. Excuse me, Crozer Seminary. So let's pick back up. Again, we are reading the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. We knocked out 3 chapters yesterday. Let's see what we can do today. During the Christmas holidays of 1949. Okay, try this again. During the Christmas holidays of 1949, I decided to spend my spare time reading Karl Marx to try to understand the appeal of communism for many people. For the first time, I carefully scrutinized Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. I also read some interpretive works on the thinking of Marx and Lenin. In reading such communist writings, I drew certain conclusions that have remained with me as convictions to this day. First, I rejected their materialistic interpretation of history. Communism, avowedly secularistic and materialistic, has no place for God. This I could never accept, for as a Christian I believe that there is a creative personal power in this universe who is the ground and essence of all reality, a power that cannot be explained in materialistic terms. History is ultimately guided by spirit, not matter. Second, I strongly disagree with communism's ethical relativism. Since for the community there is no divine government, no absolute moral order, there are no fixed, immutable principles. Consequently, almost anything, force, violence, murder, lying, is a justifiable means to the, quote, millennial, end quote, end. This type of relativism was abhorrent to me. Constructive ends can never give absolute moral justification to destructive means, because in the final analysis, the end is pre-existence in the means. And then I think that's, man, these bees is crazy. All right, I think that's something I want to have to sort of dive deeper in. And so the statement that constructive ends can never give absolute moral justification to destructive means, because in the final analysis, the end is pre-existent in the means. And so I do think that is something that is, that there's a truth in that. There's a lot of truth in that. I think that's something that is, I think that's something that different people will have different beliefs on or different understandings on. But I do believe that is part of something that has to be, that's something that you have to keep in mind when you are in the type of struggle that we are in, that constructive ends cannot give absolute moral justification to destructive means, because in the final analysis, the end is pre-existent in the means. And so, I honestly don't think I can put it any more, I can't put it better than Dr. King put it. I'm trying to reach for some type of example or something to give. But I think that just that line or that saying in itself is important. I don't really have any, I don't know, I'm still sort of trying to reach to see if it's a way to dissect this further. But I really do think that is, as he's put it, as best as it can possibly be put. So, third, I oppose communism's political totalitarianism. In communism, the individual ends up in subjection to the state. True, the Marxists would argue that the state is an, quote, interim, end quote, reality, which is to be eliminated when the classless society emerges. But the state is the end while it lasts, and man only a means to that end. And if man's so-called rights or liberties stand in the way of that end, they are simply swept aside. His liberties of expression, his freedom to vote, his freedom to listen to what news he likes or to choose his books are all restricted. Man becomes hardly more, in communism, than a depersonalized cog in the turning wheel of the state. This deprecation of individual freedom was objectionable to me. I am convinced now, as I was then, that man is an end because he is a child of God. Man is not made for the state is made for man. To deprive man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing rather than elevate him to the status of a person. Man must never be treated as a means to the end of the state, but always as an end within himself. Yet, in spite of the fact that my response to communism was and is negative, and I consider it basically evil, there were points at which I found it challenging. With all of its false assumptions and evil methods, communism grew as a protest against the hardships of the underprivileged. Communism in theory emphasized the classless society and a concern for social justice, though the world knows from sad experience that in practice, it created new classless and a new lexicon of injustice. It created new classes and a new lexicon of injustice. The Christian ought always to be challenged by any protest against unfair treatment of the poor. I also sought systematic answers to Marx's critique of modern bourgeois culture. He presented capitalism as essentially a struggle between the owners of the productive resources and the workers, whom Marx regarded as the real producers. Marx interpreted economic forces as the dialectical process by which society moved from feudalism through capitalism to socialism, with the primary mechanism of this historical movement being the struggle between economic classes whose interests were irreconcilable. Obviously, this theory left out the numerous and significant complexities, political, economic, moral, religious, and psychological, which played a vital role in shaping constellation of institutions and ideas today known as Western civilization. Moreover, it was dated in the sense that the capitalism Marx wrote about bore only a partial resemblance to the capitalism we know in this country. But in spite of the shortcomings of his analysis, Marx had raised some basic questions. I was deeply concerned from my early teen days about the gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, and my reading of Marx made me ever more conscious of this gulf. Although modern American capitalism had greatly reduced the gap through social reforms, there was still need for a better distribution of wealth. Moreover, Marx had revealed the danger of the profit motive as the sole basis of an economic system. Capitalism is always in danger of inspiring men to be more concerned about making a living than making a life. We are prone to judge success by the index of our salaries or the size of our automobiles rather than the quality of our service and relationship to humanity. Thus, capitalism can lead to a practical materialism that is as pernicious as the materialism taught by communism. In short, I read Marx as I read all of the influential historical thinkers from a dialectical point of view, combining a partial yes and a partial no. Insofar as Marx posited a metaphysical materialism, an ethical relativism, and a strangulating totalitarianism, I responded with an unambiguous no. But insofar as he pointed to weakness of traditional capitalism, contributed to the growth of a definitive self-consciousness in the masses, and challenged the social conscience of the Christian churches, I responded with a definite yes. My reading of Marx also convinced me that truth is found neither in Marxism nor in traditional capitalism. Each represents a partial truth. Historically, capitalism failed to see the truth in collective enterprise, and Marxism failed to see the truth in individual enterprise. 19th century capitalism failed to see that life is social, and Marxism failed and still fails to see that life is individual and personal. The kingdom of God is neither the thesis of individual enterprise nor the antithesis of collective enterprise, but a synthesis which reconciles the truths of both. And so I think that it's a lot of things that I want to sort of reflect on in those passages that we read. I think the first thing that I want to reflect on is the fact that, and I think H. Rap Brown is somebody who said this, that we can't take any ideologies or any revolutionary philosophies from a different place or from a different period of time and just wholesale insert them into where we are at currently in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, or racial injustice. But what we must do is to study these different revolutionary philosophies and these different revolutionary ideologies, and even if they aren't necessarily revolutionary, study these different philosophies and ideologies, and then take the things, take the portions of them that can work for where we are at as a society, for where we are at as a community, for what this struggle is. Take the things that can work and insert them, and the things that can't work, we remove those things. And I think that that's one of the things that Dr. King was doing here when he talks about the parts of Marxism and the parts of communism that he agreed with, and then when he talks about the parts that he disagreed with, when he talks about the parts that he felt would benefit his personal philosophy and ideology, and then when he talks about the ones that he felt went against what his personal philosophy and ideology was. And so what I would encourage everybody to do is to look into Marxism, to read Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, to read Lenin and read these different things with an open mind, with an understanding that we're not going to always be able to pull the answers internally. You're going to have to look externally for certain answers. And one of the things that has happened in American society is that certain words become and certain concepts become stigmatized to the point that people don't even look into them, that people don't even question what the concepts are. And communism is one of those concepts. Socialism was one of those concepts. And on the other hand, one of the other things that also happens is that people think they know what capitalism is so much that they don't look into questioning that or looking or asking any or having any second thoughts about that. And I think that both sides of those coins are wrong. The things that we have been told to accept from the mainstream American society, we must begin to question those things more. And the things that we have been told to not question, to not look into, we must begin to also question and look into those things more as well. And then let's see, it was another portion in here. I wish I should have had my highlighter, but some of this I do have highlighted. I've read through this book once and highlighted some things. I see a few things that I missed on highlighting that I should have. This sentence here. Capitalism is always in danger of inspiring men to be more concerned about making a living than making a life. We are prone to judge success by the index of our salaries or the size of our automobiles rather than the quality of our service and relationship to humanity. And I think that that's something that strikes right at the heart of what it is that we're experiencing here in Rockford, Illinois, in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. A lot of these, because people are so focused with economic gain or financial gain, because of the capitalistic society, there are people who think that that is their way to get justice, or that is their way to get equity or equality or liberty or freedoms. But that is, that's smoke and mirrors. There are certain things that money will never be able to buy you. There are certain things that being in a different class system, that no matter how high up on the class system you are, it will never be able to make you invulnerable to. But the dangers of a capitalistic society is that the society tells you that if you just get enough money, you will be able to escape these things. If you have a good enough job, if you have a nice enough car, if you have a nice enough house, you'll be able to escape these things that befall other people. And so I think that is another one of the things that comes with a society that is so rooted in how much money you make, and rooted in what career you have, and how high up you are in the job rankings that you have, and things of that nature. But most of those things Dr. King wrote about, he put them better than I can put them. So, all right, let's continue. During my stay at Crozer, I was also exposed for the first time to the pacifist position in a lecture by Dr. A.J. Moost. I was deeply moved by Dr. Moost's talk, but far from convinced of the practicability of his position. Like most of the students at Crozer, I felt that while war can never be a positive or absolute good, it could serve as a negative good in the sense of preventing the spread and growth of an evil force. War, horrible as it is, might be preferable to surrender to a totalitarian system, Nazi, fascist, or communist. During this period, I had about despaired of the power of love in solving social problems. I thought the only way we could solve our problem of segregation was an armed revolt. I felt that the Christian ethic of love was confined to individual relationships. I could not see how it could work in social conflict. And then again, I think that this is one of the things that's the most important to point out about this book is the constant growth and the constant evolution of Dr. King. The Dr. King that in the fact that he had this constant growth and constant evolution makes it so that you can understand the capacity that all of us have for this type of growth and evolution. And so as a young man in college, Dr. King felt that the only way to fix the social conflict that existed and the problems of segregation that existed for black people was through an armed revolt. And as we're going to continue reading through this segment, you will see how opening his mind up to different ideologies, to different philosophies, to different belief systems is what helped to evolve him past thinking that the only way to solve some of these problems was through armed revolt, was through violence. Perhaps my faith in love was temporarily shaken by the philosophy of Nietzsche. I had been reading parts of the genealogy of morals and the whole of the will to power. Nietzsche's glorification of power, in his theory, all life expressed the will to power, was an outgrowth of his contempt for ordinary mortals. He attacked the whole of the Hebraic Christian morality with its virtues of piety and humility, its otherworldliness, and its attitude toward suffering, as the glorification of weakness, as making virtues out of necessity and impotence. He looked to the development of a superman who would surpass man as man surpassed the ape. Then one Sunday afternoon, I traveled to Philadelphia to hear a sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University. He was there to preach for the Fellowship House of Philadelphia. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India and, to my great interest, he spoke of the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left the meeting and brought a half-dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. Like most people, I had heard of Gandhi, but I had never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by his salt march to the sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of satyagraha, satya is truth which equals love, and agraha is force. Satyagraha, therefore, means truth force or love force, was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. Prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. The, quote, turn the other cheek, end quote, philosophy, and the, quote, love your enemies, end quote, philosophy, were only valid, I felt, when individuals were in conflict with other individuals. When racial groups and nations were in conflict, a more realistic approach seemed necessary. But after reading Gandhi, I saw how utterly mistaken I was. Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethics of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. Love for Gandhi was a potent instrument for social and collective transformation. It was in this Gandhian emphasis on love and nonviolence that I discovered the method for social reform that I had been seeking. The intellectual and moral satisfaction that I failed to gain from the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill, the revolutionary methods of Marx and Lenin, the social contract theory of Hobbes, the, quote, back to nature, end quote, optimism of Rousseau, and the Superman philosophy of Nietzsche, I found in the nonviolent resistant philosophy of Gandhi. Okay, and so let's preface speaking about Gandhi with stating that Gandhi was racist. That's something that is historically known. What's up? Gandhi also, at the least, had some what I would deem some sexual assault or nearing sexual assault interactions with women. So we are not trying to speak of Gandhi as I think the pedestal that Dr. King had him on at the time was because it was very few things, a lot less things known about Gandhi. So I do want to preface anything that I say from here on by saying that I do understand that those things are understood about Gandhi now that were not necessarily understood about Gandhi at that point. And not to say that that is insignificant, but to just take time to speak on the philosophy of Gandhi as opposed to speaking on the individual that Gandhi was. The philosophy of love force or love power is something that I think is very necessary for the struggle that we are engaging in, the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. It is through having an understanding of loving every human being, or wanting and to me, love does not have to, and Dr. King talks about this later on, it's not the same. You don't necessarily have to be in love with somebody. Loving somebody doesn't even mean that you necessarily like this person. But the understanding of the concept of love is what leads me as a person to not be okay with the fact that it's people inside of the jail, no matter what they are charged with, no matter what they will be convicted of, that there are people inside of the jail who are eating food that is poisonous to them, is deadly to them. If they continue to eat that through years, the products that are put in that food will destroy their bodies. There are human beings that are inside of that jail who every day have a specter of violence that lingers over them. There are human beings inside of the jail who do not get the medicine that they are supposed to get. There are human beings inside of the jail who have to sleep on a steel table basically every night. There are human beings inside of the jail who need addiction, who have addiction issues, who have mental health issues, who are never going to be able to have those issues solved by being inside of a jail. They need care on a different type of a level. And the reason that love is important and understanding that is that there may be somebody inside of that jail who suffering from a mental health issue, who has physically assaulted somebody, who has physically harmed somebody. And if you allow yourself to, again, nobody is as bad as the worst thing that they've done, and nobody is as good as the best thing that they've done. But if we allow ourselves to get into a place where we hate everybody who has ever committed any crime, if we allow ourselves to get in a position where we don't care about what's happening to people who are inside of these jails, we will get into a place where not only are they being dehumanized, but us also as a society become barbarized from these things. We become more barbaric. We become less humane from these things. The fact that COVID went on, and who knows how many people died inside of these jails from having COVID and from catching COVID because the situations were not. Let this car go by. Because the situations were not humane inside of these jails. And a part of, again, a part of being able to tap into humaneness, a part of being able to tap into empathy and understanding, those things do come from love. It's because I love my son and love my mother and love my friends and love uncles and family members that I have, that it's certain things I would not want to happen to them. And understanding that the love that I have for them is what makes it so that I can understand someone else loving their son or their brother, their father, that may be a stranger to me. Now, I don't think that in the concept of love, you allow somebody to kill you, or you allow somebody to rob you. I don't think that love becomes something that you allow to become self-harming. But I think that the concept of love, the philosophy of love, is something that should linger over all actions that we do, over all things that we do. I think that that is what gets you into a place where you don't throw lives out, no matter what actions the person has made. It's where you get into a place where you don't prejudge somebody based off the color of their skin, or prejudge somebody based off the neighborhood that they live in, or prejudge somebody based off the community that they're from, when you can tap into that love. And again, Dr. King will, as we continue to read through this, his concepts of these, some of these things will become articulated in a more transcendent light. And as we continue to read through those things, we'll be able. I will hope that my hope would be that I will be able to again articulate these things and relate them back to police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice better. But I would have been remiss if I didn't take some time to at least try to speak on what Dr. King was pointing out there. Okay, let's continue. On the bottom of page 24. But my intellectual odyssey to nonviolence did not end here. During my senior year in theological seminary, I engaged in the exciting reading of various theological theories. Having been raised in a rather strict fundamentalist tradition, I was occasionally shocked when my intellectual journey carried me through new and sometimes complex doctrinal lands, but the pilgrimage was always stimulating. It gave me a new appreciation for objective appraisal and critical analysis and knocked me out of my dogmatic slumber. What's up? What's up? When I came to Crozer, I could accept the liberal interpretation of Christianity with relative ease. Liberalism provided me with an intellectual satisfaction that I had never found in fundamentalism. I became so enamored of the insights of liberalism that I almost fell into the trap of accepting uncritically everything that came under its name. I was absolutely convinced of the natural goodness of man and the natural power of human reason. The basic change in my thinking came when I began to question the liberal doctrine of man. My thinking went through a state of transition. At one time, I found myself leaning toward a mild, neo-orthodox view of man, and at other times, I found myself leaning toward a liberal view of man. The former leaning may root back to certain experiences that I had in the South with its vicious race problem that made it very difficult for me to believe in this essential goodness of man. The more I observed the tragedies of history and man's shameful inclination to choose the low road, the more I came to see the depths and strength of sin. Liberalism's superficial optimism concerning human nature caused it to overlook the fact that reason is darkened by sin. The more I thought about human nature, the more I saw how our tragic inclination for sin causes us to use our minds to rationalize our actions. Liberalism failed to see that reason by itself is little more than an instrument to justify man's defensive ways of thinking. Moreover, I came to recognize the complexity of man's social involvement and the glaring reality of collective evil. I came to feel that liberalism had been all too sentimental concerning human nature and that it leaned toward a false idealism. Reason, devoid of the purifying powers of faith, can never free itself from distortions and rationalizations. On the other hand, part of my liberal leaning had its source in another branch of the same root. In noticing the gradual improvements of this same race problem, I came to see some noble possibilities in human nature. Also, my liberal leaning may have rooted back to the great imprint that many liberal theologians have left upon me and to my ever-present desire to be optimistic about human nature. Of course, there is one phase of liberalism that I hope to cherish always. Its devotion to the search for truth, its insistence on an open and analytical mind, its refusal to abandon the best light of reason, its contribution to the theological, historical criticism of biblical literature has been of immeasurable value. During my last year in theological school, I began to read the works of Reinhold Niebuhr. The prophetic and realistic elements in Niebuhr's passionate style and profound thought were appealing to me and made me aware of the complexity of human motives and the reality of sin on every level of man's existence. I became so enamored of his social ethics that I almost fell into the trap of accepting uncritically everything he wrote. I read Niebuhr's critique of the pacifist position. Niebuhr had himself once been a member of the pacifist ranks. For several years, he had been national chairman of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. His break with pacifism came in the early 30s, and the first full statement of his criticism of pacifism was in Moral Man and Immoral Society. Here, he argued that there was no intrinsic moral indifference of the two methods where... All right, just back your ass up. All right, my fault. Here he argued that there was no intrinsic moral difference between violent and nonviolent resistance. The social consequences between violent and the social consequences of the two methods were different, he contended, but the differences were in degree rather than kind. Later, Niebuhr began emphasizing the irresponsibility of relying on nonviolent resistance when there was no ground for believing that it would be successful in preventing the spread of totalitarian tyranny. It could only be successful, he argued, if the groups against whom the resistance was taking place had some degree of moral conscience, as was the case in Gandhi's struggle against the British. Niebuhr's ultimate rejection of pacifism was based primarily on the doctrine of man. He argued that pacifism failed to do justice to the Reformation doctrine of justification by faith, substituting it for a sectarian perfectionism which believes, quote, that divine grace actually lifts man out of the sinful contradictions of history and establishes him above the sins of the world, end quote. At first, Niebuhr's critique of pacifism left me in a state of confusion. As I continued to read, however, I came to see more and more the shortcomings of his position. For instance, many of his statements revealed that he interpreted pacifism as a sort of passive non-resistance to evil, expressing naive trust in the power of love. But this was a serious distortion. My study of Gandhi convinced me that true pacifism is not non-resistance to evil, but non-violent resistance to evil. Between the two positions, there is a world of difference. Gandhi resisted evil with as much vigor and power as the violent resistor, but he resisted with love instead of hate. True pacifism is not unrealistic submission to evil power, as Niebuhr contends. It is rather a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love, in the faith that it is better to be the recipient of violence than the inflictor of it, since the latter only multiplies the existence of violence and bitterness in the universe, while the former may develop a sense of shame in the opponent and thereby bring about a transformation and a change of heart. In spite of the fact that I found many things to be desired in Niebuhr's philosophy, there were several points at which he constructively influenced my thinking. Niebuhr's great contribution to theology is that he has refuted the false optimism characteristic of a great segment of Protestant liberalism. Moreover, Niebuhr has extraordinary insight into human nature, especially the behavior of nations and social groups. He is keenly aware of the complexity of the human motives and of the relations between morality and power. His theology is a persistent reminder of the reality of sin on every level of man's existence. These elements in Niebuhr's thinking help me to recognize the illusions of a superficial optimism concerning human nature and the dangers of a false idealism. While I still believed in man's potential for good, Niebuhr made me realize his potential for evil as well. Moreover, Niebuhr helped me to recognize the complexity of man's social involvement and the glaring reality of collective evil. Many pacifists, I felt, failed to see this. All too many had an unwarranted optimism concerning man and leaned unconsciously towards self-righteousness. After reading Niebuhr, I tried to arrive at a realistic pacifism. In other words, I came to see the pacifist position. In other words, I came to see the pacifist position not as sinless, but as the lesser evil in the circumstances. I do not claim to be free from the moral dilemmas that the Christian non-pacifist confronts, but I am convinced that the church cannot be silent while mankind faces the threat of nuclear annihilation. I felt that the pacifist would have a greater appeal if he did not claim to be free from the moral dilemmas that the Christian non-pacifist confronts. Okay, and so we're not at the end of the chapter yet. I think we got one more little segment to get to the end of the chapter. But I just want to point out that this is, for me personally, this is, for lack of a better way of putting it, that passage there sort of encapsulates my feelings on not only nonviolent resistance, also on self-defense in sort of a manner. I don't believe violence and self-defense are the same thing. I don't believe that somebody running down the street to stab you with a knife and then you disarming this person with the knife and fighting to protect your livelihood, that is not the same thing as the person running down the street attacking you with the knife. So I want to make sure that I make a distinction when I speak on violence and nonviolent resistance. I don't believe that if somebody runs into your home with a gun trying to kill you, that you taking this gun from this person or fighting this person off and removing the gun from this person, I don't believe that that is violence. I think that that is self-defense. But so when we get into this place where we're speaking about where Dr. King is speaking about non-resistance not being the same thing as non-violent resistance, that is my exact belief. I know that there are some people who don't buy into nonviolence. There are some people who don't buy into that philosophy, but I think a lot of times people don't buy into that philosophy because they mistake it for being non-resistance. And I again believe that you can have just as much. My man, just be respectful, bro. Be respectful. You had it hot out here last night, my man. so I don't think that those things are the same thing. I think that it is 100% room for you to defend yourself and defend your livelihood, and to also be resistant to the evils that exist in a society. But I also believe that we can't be naive to think that that there aren't still some of those evils that exist in a society. The same way that you have to be understanding. The same way you have to be understanding of the fact that we live in a society where violence only begets more violence and perpetuates more violence. We have to understand we do live in a society where violence is still something. Violence is still something that is very much embedded in everything that happens here. And so we are not. When the mayor comes into work, I'm not trying to attack the mayor or trying to abduct the mayor. Because that would be, again, a form of violence. However, if something was like what happened when people come down here and wash away the chalk or tear down the memorials, we non-violently resist that by filming, by speaking to them while they're doing those things, by having megaphones, sirens. There are multiple ways to non-violently resist something, and I think that you can non-violently resist with the same militancy that people use violence. I believe that us staying out and occupying City Hall is a form of that type of militant non-violent resistance, and I think that within that militant nonviolent resistance that love can be at the crux of that. It is love that has us defend the memorials that we have up here. It's love that makes it so that when people are shot by the police, we're upset about it, even though we've never met the person who may have been shot by the police. We may have never met these people's family. It's love for our fellow human beings that has us at this place. And it is also through having that type of love and having that type of that type of philosophy of love that you are willing to struggle for humanity, to struggle for humanity being at a further place or at a better place because of that type of love that you have for your fellow human being. And I think that that is something that is not anywhere near as prevalent in a society as it needs to be. And I think that a lot of times that happens because of the status quo, and these institutions have a fear of that kind of love. They use hatred. Hatred is something that is divisive. Love is something that is that brings people together. And again, when I say this, I don't want people to think that I'm speaking of like Dr. King says, some type of unrealistic submission to evil power. I don't think that is what love is. I think that it's quite the opposite of that. It is fighting against the evil with every piece of you that you have, but also not allowing yourself to become the evil that you are fighting against. Okay, let's knock out this last page in this chapter. I anticipated graduating from Crozer in May 1951. For a number of years, I have been desirous of teaching in a college or a school of religion. Realizing the necessity for scholastic attainment in the teaching profession, I felt that graduate work would give me a better grasp of my field. I had a general knowledge of my field, but I had not done adequate research to meet the scholarly issues which I would confront in this area. I felt that a few years of intensified study in a graduate school would give me a thorough grasp of knowledge in my field. My particular interest in Boston University could be summed up in two statements. First, my thinking in philosophical areas have been greatly influenced by some of the faculty members there, particularly Dr. Edgar S. Brightman. For this reason, I long for the possibility of studying under him. Secondly, one of my professors at Crozer was a graduate of Boston University, and his great influence over me turned my eyes toward his former school. I had gotten some valuable information about Boston University from him, and I was convinced that there was a definite advantage for me going there. Okay, and then that brings us to the end of Crozer Seminary, which is chapter 3, and that brings us to the beginning of chapter 4. Chapter 4 is entitled Boston University. And so I just want to go over some of the things that was in chapter 3. In chapter 3, Dr. King spoke on his beliefs on communism. Dr. King spoke on his beliefs on totalitarianism. He spoke on his beliefs on socialism. He spoke on his beliefs on liberalism, spoke on his beliefs of love and nonviolent resistance, passive resistance. And all of those things are important because of the fact that And all those things are important because of the fact that these are his first experiences with some of these ideologies, with some of these philosophies. And as time would go by and he would extrapolate these ideologies and philosophies out, you will see how these things would grow. You will see how these things would grow. And so I think that it's important to point out where originally some of these ideas came from and his first experiences with some of these ideas and how he struggled in with these thoughts and these concepts. And I think that's something that for all of us that we have to be cognizant of is we have to struggle with some of these ideologies, struggle with some of these philosophies. We have to question where did communism come from? Where did socialism come from? We have to read Nabor, reading, I don't know if I want to tell somebody to read Gandhi, but reading Nabor is Reinhold. But reading all these different things, Marxism is what will get us to a place where we can understand these issues better and where we can be able to articulate these things better. I think that even for me, every time that I go through a different book or pick up a different book, as I'm doing with this one here, it takes a few different chapters to get into, to understand the philosophy that the person has. It takes a few different chapters to understand the language or the way that this person communicates. And then it becomes a little bit easier as you continue to read through and you understand how this person communicates and you understand how this person speaks. It becomes easier to sort of translate some of these things into your own beliefs, into your own words. And so we're on chapter 4, Boston University. So let's pick it up from here. The next stage of my intellectual pilgrimage to nonviolence came during my doctoral skills in Boston University. Here I had the opportunity to talk to many exponents of nonviolence, both students and visitors at the campus. Boston University School of Theology, under the influences of Dean Walter Mulder and Professor Alan Knight Chalmers, had a deep sympathy for the pacifist position. Both Dean Mulder and Dr. Chalmers had a passion for social justice. One never got the impression that this passion stemmed from a superficial optimism concerning human nature, but from a deep faith in the possibility of human beings when they allowed themselves to become co-workers with God. My association with men like that also caused me to deepen my concern, and of course many of the studies I continue to make concerning the philosophy and theory of nonviolence naturally influenced my thinking. Theologically, I find myself still holding to the liberal position. I had come to see more than ever before that there were certain enduring qualities in liberalism which all of the vociferous noises of fundamentalism and neo-orthodoxy could never destroy. However, while at Boston, I became much more sympathetic towards the neo-orthodox position than I had been in previous years. I do not mean that I accept neo-orthodoxy as a set of doctrines, but I did see it in a necessary corrective for a liberalism that had become all too shallow and that too easily capitulated to modern culture. Neo-orthodoxy certainly had the merit of calling us back to the depths of Christian faith. I also came to see that Reinhold Nabor had overemphasized the corruption of human nature. His pessimism concerning human nature was not balanced by an optimism concerning divine nature. He was so involved in diagnosing man's sickness of sin that he overlooked the cure of grace. I want to read that sentence one more time. He was so involved in diagnosing man's sickness of sin that he overlooked the cure of grace. I studied philosophy and theology at Boston University under Edgar S. Brightman and L. Harold DeWolf. I did most of my work under Dr. DeWolf, who was a very dear friend of mine, and, of course, I was greatly influenced by him and Dr. Brightman, whom I had the privilege to study with before he passed on. It was mainly under these teachers that I studied personalistic philosophy, the theory that the clue to the meaning of ultimate reality is found in personality. This personal idealism remains today my basic philosophical position. Personalism's insistence that only personality, finite and infinite, is ultimately real strengthened in me two convictions. It gave me metaphysical and philosophical grounding for the idea of a personal God, and it gave me a metaphysical basis for the dignity and worth of all human personality. Just before Dr. Brightman's death, I began studying the philosophy of Hegel with him. This course proved to be both rewarding and stimulating. Although the course was mainly a study of Hegel's monumental work, Phenomenology of Mind, I spent my spare time reading his philosophy of history and philosophy of right. There were points in Hegel's philosophy that I strongly disagreed with. For instance, his absolute idealism was rationally unsound to me because it tended to swallow up the many in the one. But there were other aspects of his thinking that I found stimulating. His contention that, quote, truth is the whole, end quote. Appreciate you, man. Thank you. Have a good night. Be safe out here. Appreciate it. I appreciate it for real. Thank you. Everything helps out. Thank you. Have a good night. I appreciate it for real. It's everybody. You right. It's everybody. All of us. That's a fact. That's a fact. That's a fact, my man. I appreciate it. Oh, that's what's up. I appreciate it for real, man. Just the May 30th page, the main page. Yeah, people be sharing this shit all the time. Yeah, that's love. People share this shit all the time. No, man, it's everything appreciated, bro. For real, for real.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Y'all be safe. Be safe out here. I will. I know it was crazy. That shit was crazy. Yeah, it was. We made it, though. We all good. You too, man. Be safe. And so, let's see. His analysis of the dialectical process, in spite of its shortcomings, helped me to see that growth comes through struggle. And then I want to stop there. Let's stop there. I think that is one of the, and I have this highlighted, but that was one of the things that stuck with me the most in this book. And that's something that I've reiterated to people before, but that is something that resonates with me deeply. Growth comes through struggle. And so since May 30th has happened, that is what we have taken part in here. We've taken part in struggling. When people come down here who have different ideological beliefs or different philosophical beliefs, having that conversation with them in which you're trying to get your set of beliefs across to them, and they're trying to get their set of beliefs off to you, it means that a struggle engages, a struggle ensues. When you can be able to wage that struggle with love, when you can be able to wage that struggle non-violently, that is what gets you into a place where the struggle precipitates growth. And that's what we have seen happen here. We've seen struggle precipitate growth here. The struggle that we had when Tyrus Jones was shot by the police department. People who came that said, well, Tyrus Jones is being alleged of being involved in a murder. So they don't care about what happened to Tyrus Jones. Us being able to have a struggle with our philosophy where if somebody commits a crime on the street, they should be arrested and brought in for the crime, because that is how the system is set up. Until we can get to a system that is so we can get to build systems and institutions that are more humane, we have to understand that there are systems set up in the society. And so if there's a system that is set up for somebody who has committed a crime, whether that crime be robbery, whether that crime be sexual assault, or whether that crime be murder, the police officer's job should be to arrest that person, to bring that person in, and to allow that person to go through the process of the criminal justice system. When a police officer usurps that and becomes judge, jury, and executioner, that is injustice. Now, being able to articulate why this person should not be judge, jury, and executioner. Being able to articulate how we live in a city where last year there were 36 murders. And if police officers bring in every person who is suspected to be involved in a murder, dead or alive, we are going to have a lot of dead people in the streets. If every person who is suspected of a robbery is brought in dead or alive, if every person who runs away from the police is brought in dead or alive, we will start having a lot of dead people in our streets. And the police know that. The police do not routinely bring people in dead or alive. There are specific people in specific circumstances that they deemed to be unworthy of being brought in alive, or unworthy of being brought in one piece. And there are other people that they deem worthy of being brought in one piece. Now, the struggle between my stance on that and somebody else's stance on that is what gets us to growth. The struggle between there are people that have come down here before, and they'll say all lives matter, or white lives matter too, or something like that. And anytime that happens, I understand where that comes from. And so I engage in the struggle as to why the statement or the movement or the organization, Black Lives Matter, exists. And it is in that struggle that I have with them that I've been able to grow. It's because that I've had conversations with people who come from a different philosophical belief than me, that I'm able to understand parts of my philosophy that need to be altered, and part of my ideologies that may need to be altered, and part of my tactics that may need to be altered. But if I don't engage in that struggle with the person, I can never get to that place. The same thing internally. Everybody who is part of the May 30th Alliance organization does not have the same individual ideologies, the same individual philosophies, the same individual beliefs, because nobody has went through the exact same experiences. And so it is when we struggle from our individual beliefs that we can further the organizational beliefs, that we can further the organizational ideologies. And we have to understand that struggle, whether it be internally or externally, is not a negative thing. It is not a bad thing. It is something that is necessary for growth. And it is going to take growth and evolvement for this struggle that we are waging to gain the power and gain the people needed to be able to see true change happen, to see true progress happen. So I would also say just that the same way that growth comes through struggle, progress comes through struggle. And so those are things that we have to keep in mind as we are struggling, internally and externally. And then just to finish this off again, that is why I believe that love is such an important philosophy, why I believe nonviolence is such an important philosophy, because when you can engage internally and externally in struggles, and you can have love still be at the center of them, it is what makes it so that you can leave an interaction with somebody without feeling like you have to assault the person because you don't agree with them, or you have to cuss the person out because you don't agree with them, or you have to insult the person because you don't agree with them. And the same thing for same thing with keeping nonviolence as a philosophy that's at the center of struggling. It makes it so that you can continue to struggle. Part of the thing that comes from violent struggles is that you don't always survive the violent struggle. And so you may have one violent struggle, not surviving, and then be done. As opposed to, and then again, it perpetuates more violent struggle. And so those are just a way that I wanted to try to incorporate things that we have read leading up to this with that specific statement. And I hope that statement sticks with anybody watching this heavily. It stuck with me heavily. There's no struggle with that. There's no growth without struggle. Growth comes through struggle. Progress comes through struggle. My work at Boston University progressed very well. Both Dr. DeWolf and Dr. Brightman were quite impressed. I completed my residence work and began the process of writing my dissertation. My dissertation was titled, quote, "A Comparison of the Conception of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman," end quote. The concept of God was chosen because of the central place which it occupies in any religion, and because of the ever-present need to interpret and clarify the God concept. Tillich and Wyman were chosen because they represent different types of theology, and because each of them had an increasing influence upon theological and philosophical thought. In 1954, I ended my formal training with divergent intellectual forces converging into a positive social philosophy. One of the main tenets of this philosophy was the conviction that nonviolent resistance was one of the most potent weapons available to oppress people in their quest for social justice. Interestingly enough, at this time, I had merely an intellectual understanding and appreciation of the position, with no firm determination to organize it in a socially effective situation. And then I want to harp back on one sentence in there one more time. One of the main tenets of this philosophy was the conviction that nonviolent resistance was one of the most potent weapons available to oppress people in their quest for social justice. And I think that is something that we have exhibited to the highest degree. The memorials that we have up on these poles around City Hall, that in this area we've entitled Say Their Name Square, is nonviolent resistance. It is not non-resistance. Non-resistance would be the memorials not being up at all, or non-resistance would have been putting the memorials up and then they took them down and we didn't put them back up again. But non-violent resistance is not trying to stop them physically when they tear down the memorials, not threatening to assault them or trying to intimidate them when they take down the memorials, but when they take the memorials down, putting them back up, no matter what the consequences may be for us after putting them back up. We have seen it be fines. We've seen us be arrested before for disorderly conduct while protesting when they taken down the memorials, but we still put them back up. The same thing. And that's the city who tears them down in that method. But there's also people of their own volition who individually come down, cut the memorials, spray paint the memorials. We have not tried to assault these people. We have not tried to harm these people or intimidate these people with physical force. We have simply, anytime that they have done it, if we can take a picture of them, we do. If we can film them doing it, we do. And we return the memorials to where they are at. That is not non-resistance, but that is non-violent resistance. What's up? What's up? What's up? And we have seen how that has been a potent weapon. More people know about these names and these faces than knew about them a year ago before they had been put up. And that is part of what a protest and a demonstration and resistance is. It's not allowing something the status quo to continue. The same thing with being outside of being outside of City Hall. We've been arrested for being outside of here. We've had people come in racial slurs and racial epithets from being outside of here. None of those people have been shot. None of those people have been stabbed. None of those people have had the threat of physical force lure over them. But we have also not allowed those things to stop us from continuing to be here. The same thing with the chalk. The chalk is a form of nonviolent resistance. There are people who don't agree with the language that's in the chalk, people who don't agree with the messages in the chalk, people who don't agree with the place that the chalk is at. But we have not tried to use force to get them to stop agreeing with it. We have not tried to use physical intimidation to get them to stop agreeing with it. There are some people who might be something in here, might be a pin in here somewhere. There you go. There you go. There are some people who have come down at their own volition and watched the chalk that's down on the sidewalk, washed it away, and we filmed them. Kyle and Marge Bevers came down here and washed the chalk away, and in the midst of doing it, Kyle Bevers assaulted me, sprayed me with water in the face, sprayed the phone I had with water and knocked it over. The force of the water, I believe, tore some of my flesh off. And then the police came. I was the one that was arrested. I went to jail. When I got out of jail, I came back and I put chalk back on the place that it was before. Now somebody else may be in a position where they feel the right thing to have done was to assault Kyle Bevers or to have a fight with Kyle Bevers. I don't agree that that's the right thing for me personally to have done because I understand that he came out there to wash the chalk away because of the potency of the nonviolent resistance we were putting up. I understand that when people wash the chalk away, when people tear these memorials down, when people come down here and yell out racial epithets out of the car, they are doing it because of the potency of the nonviolent resistance. And so with understanding that that is why it is happening, I'm not upset that it's happening. I'm upset that we aren't in a place where our society is past that. But I'm not upset of that action happening because I understand what precipitated it was the nonviolent resistance. And I also believe that every time that somebody comes down and they yell whatever racial epithet out the window or come down and wash the chalk away or come down and tear the memorials down, that is one racist action closer to us having a more equitable and less racist society and a more humane society. And again, it's not 100 N-words being 100 racial epithets being yelled out. If 100 happen, then we'll get to a place where there'll never be 101st. That's not true. But there are people whose mindset changes on these things when they see some guy drive down the street and yell nigger out his car. There are some people whose mindset changes when they see the city coming down and tearing down these memorials of these people over and over again. There are people whose mindset changes when they see the amount of work that the city puts into washing away chalk, or they see the reaction that certain people have because of the chalk being washed away. And so that is what it is our job to do. And it is also our job to get into a place where our society and our city is not existing with these issues being at the back of the consciousness. consciousness. They must become at the forefront of the consciousness. And so for us, we want the memorials on the light poles to be normalized. We want that to be part of the feng shui in downtown Rockford. If somebody comes in from out of town, we want them to see those things. Well, the same thing with this chalk that's on the sidewalk. When it's kids and parents, there's all types of people who come. We want the chalk on the sidewalk to challenge what is the usual status quo. We want it to challenge their belief system. And again, that's why it's important to understand that growth comes through struggle. And so it is a struggle when somebody comes down here and they don't agree with what's on the what's written down on the sidewalk in chalk, and then they go to engage in a conversation or a dialogue or a debate with somebody. That is a struggle happening. But that struggle will precipitate growth. That will go and tell their kids about the interaction they had, or their brother or their girlfriend or their boyfriend or their sister about the interaction that they had. And hopefully that's another challenge that happens, or another struggle that happens, that they have that conversation inside of their homes, and they have that conversation with somebody who feels differently, and then that precipitates growth. But again, we have to understand some of these philosophies on this type of a level, some of these ideologies and tactics on this type of a level, so we don't get into a place where we're pushing false narratives about some of these things. Let's see. Here, somebody that's down here wrote something, so I'm gonna read what he wrote. He said, "There's often a disproportionate balance of power present in nonviolent resistance between oppressors and oppressed. It takes hours, days, weeks to put on the chalk, months, almost a year, but only water to tear it down. Violence from the oppressor forces nonviolent resistors to give up the high power we have, but not so much as the world with violent resistance." I said that right? Did I butcher? I might have butchered some of that.
Not so much as we have to give up power, but not so much as we would if we were violently resistant.
Not so much as we would. Okay.
We're gonna die.
Okay, right. I agree. I agree with that. Yes, if you were having if it was violent resistance, even though you may make a stronger push initially with the violent resistance, whatever the pushback from the violent resistance would be much greater than the pushback from nonviolent resistance.
What I'm trying to make is that I'm trying to draw attention to that disproportionate power that the violent oppressor pushes down the people trying to
Use nonviolence.
to non-violently revolt.
Yes, I agree. And they use violence in the action of doing that, and they have the
Invested over petty things that normal citizens.
yes,
So we had to give up some of our
liberties. Yes, that is 100% true. And I would have gave you the mic, but I know you didn't want the mic. But that was a good point. That was a good point. Where are we at? All right, we're almost at the end of this chapter. So let's knock this chapter out, and then the next chapter is chapter 5, Coretta. I'm gonna stop this live, and then later on today we'll probably try to jump back in this book. The situation. Okay. In 1954, I ended my formal training with divergent intellectual forces converging into a positive social philosophy. One of the main tenets of this philosophy was the conviction that nonviolent resistance was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their quest for social justice. Interestingly enough, at this time I had merely an intellectual understanding and appreciation of the position, with no firm determination to organize it in a socially effective situation. The thing that we need in the world today is a group of men and women who will stand up for right and be opposed to wrong wherever it is. A group of people who have come to see that some things are wrong, whether they're never caught up with. Some things are right, whether nobody sees you doing them or not. All I'm trying to say is, our world hinges on moral foundations. God has made it so. God has made the universe to be based on a moral law. This universe hinges on moral foundations. There is something in this universe that justifies Carlyle in saying, "No lie can live forever." There is something in this universe that justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying, "Truth crushed to the earth will rise again." There is something in this universe that justifies James Russell Lowell in saying, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. With that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown stands God. within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. There is something in this universe that justifies the biblical writer in saying, "You shall reap what you sow." As a young man with most of my life ahead of me, I decided early to give my life to something eternal and absolute. Not to these little guys that are here today and gone tomorrow, but to God, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm not going to put my ultimate faith in the little guys that can be destroyed in an atomic age, but the God who has been our help in ages past and our hope for years to come and our shelter in the time of storm and our eternal home. That's the God that I'm putting my ultimate faith in. The God that I'm talking about this morning is the God of the universe and the God that will last through the ages. If we are to go forward this morning, we've got to go back and find that God. That is the God that demands and commands our ultimate allegiance. If we are to go forward, we must go back and rediscover these precious values, that all reality hinges on moral foundations and that all reality has spiritual control. All right, and that brings us to chapter 5, Coretta. It's when Dr. King meets his wife. I'm going to wrap this live up. We knocked out chapter 3 and 4. Probably be back later on for chapter 5. I know that maybe some people who are listening in, anticipating hearing about some of the struggles that Dr. King was involved in. That will begin on chapter 7. The Montgomery movement begins. So we got about 2 chapters before we get to there. But I do think it's important that we sort of see how where Dr. King started out in his philosophy. Here, let me close this book and while we do some closing notes. I think the main thing that I get from that I got from the first time I read and also reading it again here is how far removed Dr. King was from some of his ideologies and philosophies and tactics and concepts that would come later on in his life when he was younger. I've said multiple times, and I still believe this, that to be conscious as a black person in the society, in American society, is to be constantly angry, to be constantly enraged. But I think that part of having that consciousness is getting to a place where you can temper that with other emotions and temper that with other feelings. I think that even though being a black person in this society puts you in a position where you are constantly feeling that emotion or feeling those things, I think that being a father or being a son or being a friend or being a husband or being a wife or being someone's daughter, those are things that can balance out that anger, that can balance out some of the negative emotions that may come with existing in this society. And so Dr. King is no different than any other black person that has existed that became conscious of what it is that they were existing in. Dr. King said that when he was 14 years old, that he hated white people. He thought that he felt that he hated all white people because of the experiences he had. And it wasn't until he began to go to college and meet different white people and have different interactions and have different experiences and be exposed to different ideologies that he was able to overcome that hate. The same thing, he said that he did not believe that it would be possible to have a resistance to the segregation that existed in the society without a violent revolt. And then you see how, as he learned more about some of these concepts and ideologies, whether it be Gandhi and communism and socialism and furthering his belief on liberalism and furthering his theology education, he began to see alternative ways besides a violent revolt to deal with those things. And so there's a whole humongous section of black people and young black people that live in this community that I'm sure have, because of their experiences, feel like they hate white people or hate all white people, or because of their experiences feel like the only way that some of these things will be able to be resolved is through some type of violent revolt as well. And I believe that it is a job of people like me to provide alternatives to that ideology and alternatives to that philosophy, and to struggle against that philosophy and ideology to get to a place of progress and to get to a place of growth. And so those are some of the things that I take away from the last 2 chapters that we read. And again, Dr. King really put all of these things a lot more articulately and a lot more eloquently than I can put them at this moment. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this live up. And we're going to end these live the way we end all the lives by saying justice for Demetrius Bennett, justice for Logan Bell, justice for Kerry Blake, justice for Geno Washington, justice for Jovan Fresco, justice for Mark Barmore, justice for Philip Johnson, justice for Jasper Banks, justice for Suzette Babler, justice for Joseph McCormick, justice for Faustin Guetigo, justice for Mike Sago, justice for Mikey Guzman, justice for Eddie Patterson, justice for Shannon Graves. We outside.